Welcome to Her True Stories, where every betrayal becomes a masterclass in justice. They say grief brings out the best in people, that loss reveals true character, that family bonds grow stronger in times of sorrow. But sometimes the opposite happens. Sometimes the people you trust most choose the moment of your greatest vulnerability to show you exactly who they really are. Don't just listen and leave. Hit subscribe so you'll never miss another story that speaks to your soul. These are real stories about real people who discovered that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, plans, and strikes with surgical precision when the time is right. My name is Brina Asher, and this is the story of how I learned that some gifts come wrapped in grief, and some justice comes served cold. Sometimes the deepest wounds are inflicted at gravesides. The rain fell in steady sheets across Willow Creek Cemetery, each droplet carrying the weight of my shattered world. I stood beside my daughter Claire's grave, watching as the last mourners hurried away under black umbrellas, eager to escape the Oregon gloom and return to their warm, living lives. At 58, I'd buried my parents, my husband, and now my only child. Claire had been everything to me, my bright, beautiful daughter who'd inherited her father's quick mind and my stubborn heart. The cancer had taken her in 6 brutal months, and I'd spent every day of those months by her side, holding her hand as she fought a battle she was destined to lose. Now she was gone, and I was alone in the rain with Jason Hartwell, the man she'd married 3 years ago in a ceremony filled with such joy and promise. Jason, who I'd welcomed as the son I'd never had. Jason, who'd called me Mom and hugged me at Christmas and promised to love Claire until death do them part. Death had done them part, all right. It had also done something else. It had revealed who Jason truly was. "That was a beautiful service," I said quietly, brushing raindrops from the white roses I'd placed on Claire's headstone. She would have loved the music. Jason stood beside me, immaculate in his black suit, checking his phone with the casual indifference of a man attending a business meeting rather than his wife's burial. "Yeah, well, it's over now." Over. As if Claire's life could be summarized so coldly, so finally. "I know this is difficult," I continued, my voice steady despite the storm raging in my chest. "For both of us. But we have each other now. We're family." Jason looked up from his phone, and something in his expression made my blood run cold. It wasn't grief I saw there, or shared sorrow, or even the awkward discomfort of a man struggling with loss. It was calculation. "Actually, Brina, we need to talk about that." The way he said my name, not Mom as he had for 3 years, but Brina, told me everything I needed to know before he spoke another word. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I didn't want to know the answer. "I mean the living situation. You've been staying with us for the past 6 months, and I appreciate that you wanted to help Claire through her illness. But she's gone now, and I need to move forward with my life." My hands stilled on the rose petals. "Move forward. Don't be so dramatic, Brina. Pack your bags. I can't feed an extra mouth." The words hit me like physical blows. I stared at this man I thought I knew, this man who'd held my daughter's hand as she died, this man who was now standing over her grave and throwing me out like unwanted luggage. "You mean you can't feed mine?" I said softly, the words barely audible over the rain. "It's nothing personal. You'll figure something out. You're a smart woman. You managed fine before Claire got sick." Before Claire got sick, I'd had my own small apartment across town. Before Claire got sick, I'd had my savings account and my independence and my dignity. Before Claire got sick, I'd liquidated everything to help pay for her treatments, sold my furniture, and moved in with her and Jason to provide round-the-clock care because the medical bills had exhausted their insurance and Jason had claimed he couldn't afford private nursing. I'd given them everything I had, my money, my home, my life, because I believed we were family. because I'd thought Jason loved Claire enough to let me be part of whatever remained after she was gone. I was wrong. Jason, I began, my voice carrying the weight of 3 years of shared meals and Christmas mornings and family vacations. Claire wouldn't want this. She wouldn't want you to turn me out like a stranger. Claire's dead, he said with brutal efficiency. And I have to think about my future now. I'm 34 years old, Brina. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life taking care of you.
Taking care of me.
As if I were some burden he'd inherited along with Claire's jewelry and furniture. As if the woman who'd raised his wife, who'd held his hand when the doctors delivered their devastating diagnosis, who'd cooked his meals and cleaned his house, and asked for nothing but a place to grieve, was somehow an obligation he couldn't afford. Where am I supposed to go? I asked, hating the vulnerability in my voice, but unable to hide it. Jason shrugged, already walking toward his BMW. You'll figure it out. You always do. He paused at the car door and looked back at me one last time. I'd like you gone by tonight. I'm having some friends over, and it would be awkward. Friends over. The night after his wife's funeral, Jason Hartwell was having friends over, and my presence would be awkward. I watched him drive away, his taillights disappearing into the gray afternoon like the last remnants of the life I'd thought I was building. Then I was alone with Claire's grave and the rain, and the crushing realization that I had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. I reached into my purse and pulled out the one thing I'd saved from the house before Jason could claim it, Claire's favorite scarf, a soft blue cashmere she'd worn throughout her treatments because it was gentle against her skin when the chemotherapy made everything else feel like sandpaper. I held it to my face and breathed in the faint scent of her perfume, and for the first time since the diagnosis, I allowed myself to cry. Not for Claire. She was beyond pain now, beyond disappointment and betrayal and the casual cruelty of people like Jason. I cried for myself, for the trust I'd placed in someone who'd seen my love as weakness and my grief as inconvenience. But even as the tears fell, something else was building inside me. Something harder and colder than sorrow. Something that would sustain me through whatever came next. Jason Hartwell thought he was done with me, that he could discard me like he was discarding everything else that reminded him of Claire. He thought I was just a broken old woman with nowhere to turn and no way to fight back. He was about to learn how wrong he was. I folded Claire's scarf carefully and placed it back in my purse. Then I walked to my old Toyota, the one asset I still possessed, and drove away from the cemetery. I had arrangements to make. Sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what you're truly made of. The Walmart parking lot became my world for 7 days and 6 nights. I'd chosen this particular location carefully. It was well lit, had security cameras, and was far enough from Jason's neighborhood that I wouldn't risk the humiliation of being seen by anyone who knew me. The store was open 24 hours, which meant access to restrooms and the basic necessities of survival. During the day, I sat in my car and planned. During the night, I slept fitfully in the back seat, using Claire's scarf as a pillow and trying not to think about how far I'd fallen from the woman I'd been just a week ago. I'd been beautiful once. Men had turned their heads when I walked by, had competed for my attention at parties and social gatherings. Even now, at 58, I maintained the elegant bone structure and clear skin that had been my inheritance from a long line of beautiful women. But beauty, I was learning, meant nothing when you were sleeping in a car and eating gas station sandwiches. On the 3rd day, a security guard approached my car. He was young, maybe 25, with kind eyes and the awkward manner of someone who didn't enjoy the uncomfortable parts of his job.
Mang?
Is everything all right? I've noticed you've been here for a few days. I rolled down my window and gave him the smile I'd perfected over years of hiding pain behind polite facades. Oh, I'm fine, officer. Just waiting for some repairs to be completed on my house. Insurance, should be resolved soon. He nodded, clearly wanting to believe me. Okay, ma'am. Just if you need anything, the store manager's name is Dave. He's good people. After he left, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror and was shocked by what I saw. My hair, usually styled to perfection, hung limp and lifeless around my face. My clothes, the same black dress I'd worn to Claire's funeral, were wrinkled and stained. My eyes, once bright with life and laughter, looked hollow and defeated. This was what Jason had reduced me to. This was what his casual cruelty had accomplished. On the 5th day, I made a decision. I couldn't continue like this, couldn't let grief and shock paralyze me into accepting this degradation as my fate. I had to take action, had to reclaim some small measure of dignity and control. I used the store's restroom to clean up as best I could, then drove to the public library. The librarian, a middle-aged woman with sympathetic eyes, didn't ask questions when I requested computer access and a quiet place to make phone calls. I spent hours researching resources for displaced women, housing assistance programs, job placement services for people my age. The information was overwhelming and depressing: months-long waiting lists, complex application processes, requirements I couldn't meet without a permanent address. But as I scrolled through endless websites and filled out form after form, I began to feel something I hadn't experienced since Jason's betrayal: purpose. I was fighting back, even if it was just fighting for the basic right to exist with dignity. On the 6th day, exhaustion nearly broke me. I'd slept poorly again, haunted by dreams of Claire and nightmares about my uncertain future. The constant stress had triggered a migraine that left me nauseated and barely able to see. I sat in my car, head in my hands, wondering if this was how my story would end: a formerly successful woman dying alone in a parking lot, forgotten and unmourned. That's when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer it. The number was unfamiliar, probably another bill collector or automated sales call. But something made me pick up, perhaps the desperate hope that any human voice might offer some small comfort. Mrs. Asher? This is Thomas Eddings. I was your daughter's attorney. Thomas Eddings. I remembered him from the estate meetings we'd had after Claire's diagnosis, when she'd insisted on getting her affairs in order despite Jason's protests that such preparations were morbid and premature. He was a tall, distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of gravitas that came from decades of handling people's most important legal matters. Mr. Eddings, I managed, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. How are you? I'm well, thank you, Mrs. Asher. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time, but there's something important we need to discuss. Something regarding Claire's estate that, well, it's complicated. I don't understand. Jason inherited everything. The house, the accounts, everything was in both their names. That's what Mr. Hartwell believes, yes. And it's mostly true. But Claire was thorough in her planning. She wanted to make sure you were taken care of, regardless of what happened after her death. My heart began to beat faster. What do you mean? Mrs. Asher, there's something you need to see. Something Claire set up specifically for you. Could we meet? I'd prefer to discuss this in person. I looked around the parking lot, at the shopping carts and the strangers going about their normal lives, at my reflection in the window showing a woman who'd been sleeping in her car for nearly a week.
Yes.
Yes, of course. When? Would this afternoon work? Say 2 o'clock? My office is downtown on 5th Street. After I hung up, I sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Claire had planned something for me? Something Jason didn't know about? It seemed impossible. They'd shared everything, had no secrets from each other. At least, that's what I believed. But then again, I believed Jason loved me as family. I believed grief brought people together rather than driving them apart. I believed a lot of things that had turned out to be wrong. For the first time in a week, I felt something besides despair stirring in my chest. Not hope. I wasn't ready for that yet. But curiosity. And beneath that, something harder and more dangerous. If Claire had left me something, if she'd seen this betrayal coming and planned for it, then maybe my story wasn't over after all. Maybe it was just beginning. I spent the remaining hours until my appointment trying to make myself presentable. A thorough wash in the store restroom, careful attention to my hair and makeup, the best outfit I could assemble from my limited wardrobe. By the time I walked into Thomas Edding's office that afternoon, I looked like the woman I'd been before Jason's cruelty had nearly broken me. But inside, I was becoming someone new. Someone harder, more calculating, more dangerous than the trusting woman who'd stood beside her daughter's grave a week ago. Claire had planned for me. Now it was time to find out what she'd seen coming that I'd been too naive to anticipate. Sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most devastating losses. Thomas Edding's office occupied the top floor of a converted Victorian mansion in downtown Portland's legal district. The building was the kind of understated elegance that spoke of old money and older traditions, polished wood, leather-bound law books, and the sort of quiet authority that comes from generations of handling society's most delicate affairs. I sat in the reception area, trying to project calm competence while my stomach churned with anxiety and desperate hope. The secretary, a woman about my age with kind eyes and silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, offered me tea and spoke in the gentle tones reserved for the recently bereaved. "Mr. Eddings will see you now, Mrs. Asher." His office was exactly what I'd expected: floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive oak desk, windows that looked out over the city where I'd once lived a normal, comfortable life. Thomas rose as I entered, extending his hand with the grave courtesy that had marked all our previous interactions. "Brina," he said, and I was grateful that he used my first name without the awkward formality that had characterized so many of my recent encounters. "Thank you for coming. Please sit down." I took the chair across from his desk, the same chair I'd occupied 6 months ago when Claire had insisted on updating her will despite Jason's objections. She'd been so thin then, the chemotherapy having stolen her hair and much of her weight, but her mind had been sharp and her determination absolute. "I want to make sure everyone I love is protected," she'd said that day, her voice weak but resolute. "Especially my mother." Thomas opened a file folder and spread several documents across his desk. "Brina, what I'm about to tell you will come as a shock. Claire asked me to wait at least a week after the funeral before contacting you, to give you time to process your grief and to see how circumstances developed." "Circumstances?" "Your living situation. Your relationship with Jason." Claire was very specific about that. He looked at me with eyes that held both sympathy and something else, approval, perhaps. She anticipated that Jason might not be as supportive as he appeared during her illness. The words hit me like a physical blow. She knew he would throw me out. She suspected it was a possibility. Claire was an intelligent woman, Brina. She saw things, heard things, noticed patterns of behavior that concerned her. She never said anything to you because she didn't want to add to your worry during her treatment, but she made preparations. Thomas picked up one of the documents and handed it to me. The letterhead read Pacific Northwest Trust and Estate Services, and the paper had the weight and quality that comes with serious legal instruments. "This is a trust document, established 18 months ago when Claire first received her diagnosis. She funded it gradually, moving money from various accounts she maintained separately from her joint assets with Jason." I stared at the document, the legal language swimming before my eyes. "I don't understand. What kind of money?" Claire and Jason were comfortable, but they weren't wealthy. The medical bills were paid from their joint accounts and insurance, yes. But Claire had resources Jason wasn't aware of. Her grandmother's inheritance, which came to her directly when she turned 30. Some investments, she'd made with her own money before the marriage. A small life insurance policy she'd maintained separately. My hands began to shake as I read the numbers on the page. Trust value, $8,247,000. This can't be right, I whispered. $8 million? That's impossible. It's quite real, I assure you. Claire was very careful about growing this fund over the years. She saw it as security for her future family, but when the cancer diagnosis came, she redirected its purpose. Thomas leaned forward, his expression intent. Brina, this money is yours. All of it. Claire set up the trust with you as the sole beneficiary, with specific instructions that it only be activated if certain conditions were met. What conditions? If she died before age 40, which unfortunately came to pass, and if you were left without adequate support from her surviving spouse. He paused meaningfully. Jason's behavior this week has certainly met that criteria. I stared at the documents, trying to process what I was hearing. Claire had left me $8 million. My daughter, who I thought had shared everything with her husband, had secretly accumulated a fortune and left it all to me. Why didn't she tell me? Because she hoped she wouldn't need to. She hoped the cancer would go into remission, that she'd live a long life, that Jason would prove worthy of the trust she'd placed in him. Thomas's voice hardened slightly. She also hoped that if the worst happened, Jason would honor the promises he'd made to both of you about being family. But she suspected he wouldn't. She suspected he might not. Claire was pragmatic about human nature, especially when it came to money and grief. She wanted to make sure you'd be protected regardless of what anyone else chose to do. I looked up from the documents, my mind reeling with the implications. What happens now? Now you have choices. The money is yours, free and clear. Claire structured the trust to avoid estate taxes and keep the funds completely separate from anything Jason might claim. You can access it immediately. Jason doesn't know about this? He has no idea it exists. Claire never mentioned it to him, never used any of this money for household expenses or medical bills. As far as he knows, her estate consists only of the assets he inherited, the house, their joint accounts, her personal effects. I thought about Jason's casual dismissal of me at the cemetery, his cold calculation about what my life was worth to him. He'd thrown me out believing I had nowhere to turn, no resources to fight back with, no way to survive except on his sufferance. He was wrong. Mr. Eddings, I said slowly, an idea beginning to form in my mind. What exactly do you know about Jason's financial situation? Thomas smiled slightly, and I realized that Claire's lawyer was far more perceptive than his distinguished manner suggested. Why do you ask? Because I have the feeling Claire chose her lawyer very carefully. And I suspect she told you more than just how to distribute her money. Claire was concerned about Jason's business practices. Some of his investments, his debt load, his tendency to leverage everything for short-term gains. She mentioned that his financial situation was more precarious than it appeared. How precarious? Quite precarious, from what she understood. Heavy borrowing, risky ventures, a lifestyle that requires constant cash flow to maintain. Thomas leaned back in his chair. She worried that if something happened to her, Jason would be in serious financial trouble without the stability her income provided. I smiled for the first time since Claire's funeral, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Mr. Eddings, I think I'm going to need your services for more than just estate administration. What did you have in mind? I'd like to make some investments. Some very specific investments in businesses and properties that might benefit someone in financial distress. I folded the trust documents carefully and placed them in my purse, next to Claire's scarf. And I think I'm going to need a place to live while I plan my future. I can recommend some excellent realtors. That won't be necessary. I have some very specific requirements for location and privacy. I stood up, feeling stronger and more purposeful than I had since Claire's diagnosis. Thank you, Mr. Eddings, for everything. Claire chose well when she selected you as her advocate. She chose well when she chose you as her mother, Brina. What you did for her during her illness, the sacrifices you made, she wanted to make sure you were rewarded for that love. As I left Thomas's office and walked back to my car, my temporary home in the Walmart parking lot, I felt the ghost of my daughter's hand in mine. She'd seen this coming, had planned for Jason's betrayal, had made sure I wouldn't be left defenseless and alone. Claire had given me more than money. She'd given me the means to exact justice on the man who'd thrown her mother away like garbage the day after her funeral. I drove to the nearest hotel and checked into a suite, using one of the credit cards Thomas had given me to access the trust funds. Then I ran a hot bath, ordered room service, and began planning the systematic destruction of Jason Hartwell's life.
He thought he was done with me.
He thought I was just a broken old woman with nowhere to turn. He was about to learn that some gifts come with very sharp edges, and some mothers have more resources than their sons-in-law could ever imagine. The game was just beginning. The most effective predators are the ones their prey never see coming. 3 weeks after my meeting with Thomas Eddings, I was no longer the desperate woman sleeping in a Walmart parking lot. I was something far more dangerous, a wealthy woman with a purpose and unlimited time to pursue it. I'd established myself in a furnished corporate apartment in Northwest Portland, the kind of anonymous luxury that catered to business executives and wealthy divorcees who needed temporary housing while arranging their lives. My neighbors were polite strangers who traveled frequently and minded their own business, perfect for someone who needed privacy to plan a careful campaign of destruction. The first step had been research. I hired Daniel Morrison, a private investigator recommended by Thomas's firm, to compile a comprehensive profile of Jason's financial situation. Daniel was a former FBI agent who specialized in white-collar investigations, and his reports were thorough enough to satisfy a forensic accountant. Your son-in-law is a textbook case of overextension, Daniel told me during our second meeting, spreading financial documents across my dining room table. High income, higher expenses, and debt leveraged against assets that are losing value in the current market. I studied the reports while sipping coffee from Bone China, a small luxury that reminded me I was no longer powerless. Walk me through it. He owns 3 properties, the family home where he lives, a rental duplex, and a small office building where he runs his consulting business. All 3 are mortgaged to the hilt. The rental property is barely breaking even after maintenance costs, and the office building has 2 vacant units he can't seem to fill. And his business? Marketing consulting for mid-sized companies. Decent client base, but the income is unpredictable. He's got about 18 months of operating expenses saved, which sounds good until you factor in his personal spending habits. Daniel turned to another page, showing credit card statements and loan documents. He drives a BMW lease he can't really afford, belongs to a country club that costs more than most people's rent, and has a gambling habit he thinks nobody knows about. Gambling. Online poker, mostly. Some sports betting. Nothing catastrophic yet, but the pattern's escalating. He's also been making some questionable stock investments, high-risk tech startups that aren't panning out. I smiled slightly. Jason's weaknesses were even more extensive than I'd hoped. What's his cash flow situation? Tight. Very tight. He's got maybe 4 months of liquid reserves if everything stays exactly as it is. But if he loses a major client, or has a big repair expense, or one of those investments goes completely bad. Daniel shrugged. He'd be in serious trouble very quickly. And his debt, spread across multiple lenders, which is actually smart from a risk management standpoint. No single creditor holds enough to force bankruptcy, but collectively they represent a significant monthly burden. Daniel looked at me with professional curiosity. May I ask what you're planning to do with this information? I'm planning to become very involved in Jason's financial life, I said calmly. without him knowing it, of course. Over the next month, I began acquiring pieces of Jason's debt through a network of shell companies and financial intermediaries that Thomas's firm helped me establish. It was surprisingly easy. Most creditors were happy to sell loans to investors who offered immediate cash in exchange for the right to collect future payments. I started small, purchasing the note on his BMW lease through a company called Pacific Asset Management. Then I acquired part of his credit card debt from a bank that was clearing non-performing loans from their books. Within 6 weeks, I owned approximately 40% of Jason's total obligations, all through entities that could never be traced back to me. But debt acquisition was only the first phase. The second phase involved his business. Jason's consulting firm depended heavily on referrals and long-term client relationships. Through Daniel's research, I learned that his biggest client was a restaurant chain called Northwest Casual Dining, which represented nearly 30% of his annual revenue. It took 3 conversations and a substantial consulting fee, but I managed to convince Northwest Casual Dining CEO that his company needed to diversify their vendor relationships and explore fresh perspectives in their marketing approach. I never mentioned Jason by name, simply suggested that relying too heavily on a single consultant might limit their strategic options. 6 weeks later, Jason lost the account. Simultaneously, I began working on his rental property income. The duplex he owned was in a transitional neighborhood that was popular with young professionals. Through another shell company, I purchased the vacant lot next door and began construction on a modern apartment complex that would offer better amenities at competitive prices. I also anonymously reported several minor building code violations at Jason's duplex to the city, forcing him to spend money on repairs and improvements he couldn't afford. The beauty of this approach was its subtlety. Each setback appeared to be either bad luck or natural market forces. Jason had no reason to suspect that his misfortunes were orchestrated by anyone, let alone by the woman he dismissed as a powerless burden. I monitored his stress levels through social media and mutual acquaintances. His Facebook posts became increasingly bitter, complaining about disloyal clients and impossible business conditions. Friends who'd attended Claire's funeral told me he'd started drinking more, had resigned from the country club to focus on business, and seemed generally overwhelmed by his circumstances. Good. But I wasn't finished. Not even close. The third phase involved his personal relationships. Jason had started dating within a month of Claire's death. A blonde marketing executive named Ashley, who was 15 years younger and had expensive tastes. Through Daniel's surveillance, I learned that Jason was spending money he didn't have trying to impress her with elaborate dinners and weekend getaways. I made sure those getaways became more expensive by purchasing hotel properties in their favorite destinations and raising room rates. I also ensured that several restaurants where they dined regularly were suddenly booked solid when Jason tried to make reservations, forcing him to choose more expensive alternatives. Ashley began complaining publicly about Jason's financial instability and questioning whether he was serious about building a future together. Within 2 months, she'd moved on to someone with better prospects. By November, for months after Claire's funeral, Jason Hartwell was a man under siege. His business income had dropped by 40%, his personal expenses remained high, and his debt payments were consuming an increasingly large portion of his monthly cash flow. He'd started putting expenses on credit cards, borrowing against his home equity, and making desperate investment choices in hopes of quick returns. Each decision made his situation worse, creating a downward spiral that accelerated with every passing week. But the most satisfying part wasn't his financial distress, it was his complete ignorance of what was happening to him. He still believed I was just a discarded woman with no resources and no power to affect his life. He had no idea that his dead wife's mother was systematically dismantling everything he'd built, one careful move at a time. And the best part? I was just getting started. The real punishment hadn't even begun yet. The cruelest trap is the one disguised as salvation. December arrived in Oregon with its usual palette of gray skies and endless rain, but I never felt more energized. From my apartment windows, I could see the city where Jason was slowly drowning in financial quicksand of my creation, completely unaware that every setback had been carefully orchestrated by the woman he'd thrown away like garbage. His situation had deteriorated even faster than I'd hoped. Daniel's latest report showed that Jason had missed 2 credit card payments, had borrowed an additional $50,000 against his home equity, and was now juggling bills like a street performer desperately trying not to drop any of the spinning plates. He's starting to panic, Daniel told me over coffee in my apartment, making increasingly desperate moves. Last week he tried to get a second mortgage on the rental property, but his debt-to-income ratio is too high now. Banks won't touch him. How long before he faces serious consequences? At his current burn rate? Maybe 60 days before he defaults on something major. The house payments are still current, but barely. If he loses one more significant client or has any major unexpected expense, he'd be looking at foreclosure or bankruptcy. Either way, his comfortable lifestyle would be over. I smiled, remembering his casual dismissal of me at Claire's graveside. I can't feed an extra mouth. Well, Jason was about to learn what it felt like when no one wanted to feed his mouth either. But as satisfying as his financial destruction had been to orchestrate, it wasn't enough. I wanted more than his money. I wanted his hope. I wanted him to believe he'd found salvation, only to discover it was actually damnation in disguise. That's when I decided to reveal myself. I called Thomas Eddings and asked him to arrange a meeting with Jason. Tell him that I've come into some unexpected resources and that I'd like to discuss a possible business arrangement. What kind of business arrangement? The kind that offers help to someone in desperate need. I paused, considering my words carefully. Claire would have wanted me to make sure Jason was taken care of, given how much she loved him. It seems like the right thing to do. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Brina, what exactly are you planning? I'm planning to be very generous to my late daughter's husband. After all, we're family. The meeting was arranged for the following Thursday at Thomas's office. I spent considerable time preparing my appearance, not the broken woman Jason had last seen, but not obviously wealthy either. I wanted to look like someone who'd managed to get back on her feet through modest means, someone who might have a small inheritance or insurance settlement to share. I arrived early and waited in Thomas's conference room, watching through the windows as Jason's BMW pulled into the parking lot. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in his movements as he hurried through the rain, clearly uncomfortable with this meeting but too desperate to refuse the possibility of help. Thomas brought him in at exactly 2 o'clock. Jason looked older than his 34 years, stress etched in the lines around his eyes and the set of his shoulders. His suit was expensive but showed signs of wear, and I noticed he'd lost weight, not the healthy kind that comes from exercise, but the gaunt look of someone who wasn't sleeping or eating properly. Brina, he said awkwardly, taking the chair across from me. You look well. Thank you, Jason. I'm doing much better now. I folded my hands in my lap and studied him with the same calm attention I might give to an interesting museum exhibit. I heard you've been having some business difficulties. His face flushed slightly. Where did you hear that? Small town. People talk. I kept my voice gentle, maternal even. I also heard that Ashley moved on to someone else. I'm sorry. I know how much Claire wanted you to find happiness again. The mention of Claire hit him visibly, and I saw guilt flicker across his features before he pushed it away. Yeah, well, that didn't work out. Dating is expensive, I observed. Especially when you're trying to maintain the lifestyle someone expects.
I've managing fine.
Of course you are. But Jason, I want you to know that I don't hold any grudges about what happened after the funeral. You are grieving too, and grief makes us all do things we might regret later. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Look, Brina, if this is about you moving back into the house. Oh no, nothing like that. I have my own place now, and I'm quite comfortable. I smiled warmly. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about an opportunity that might benefit both of us. What kind of opportunity? I reached into my purse and withdrew a cashier's check, placing it on the table where he could see the amount. $200,000. Jason's eyes widened. Where did you get that kind of money? Claire had a small life insurance policy that named me as a secondary beneficiary. It took some time to process, but it finally came through. The lie rolled off my tongue smoothly, practiced and believable. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to help someone I care about. You want to give me money? I want to invest in your business. Help you weather this difficult period and get back on your feet. I leaned forward slightly, projecting maternal concern. Claire loved you, Jason. She would want me to make sure you're okay. He stared at the check as if it might disappear if he looked away. I don't understand. After what I said at the funeral, after how I treated you. You were in pain. We both were. But family is family, and Claire would never forgive me if I let pride prevent me from helping you when you need it most. Thomas cleared his throat. Mrs. Asher has asked me to draw up an investment agreement. Very generous terms, essentially a personal loan at below-market interest rates, with flexible repayment options. What's the catch? Jason asked, though his eyes never left the check.
No catch.
Just a promise that you'll use this money wisely to stabilize your business and your life. I paused, letting maternal warmth fill my voice. And maybe we can rebuild some kind of relationship. I miss having family, Jason. Claire's death left me very alone. I saw the moment his greed overcame his suspicion. The check represented salvation from his mounting debts, relief from the crushing pressure that had been building for months. He wanted to believe in my generosity because he desperately needed it to be real. The terms would be very favorable, Thomas continued, sliding a contract across the table. 2% annual interest, no payments for the first 6 months to give you time to stabilize, then modest monthly payments over 5 years. Jason picked up the agreement and scanned it quickly. I could see him doing mental calculations, how much his monthly payments would decrease if he used this money to pay down his highest interest debts, how much breathing room it would give him to rebuild his client base. This is incredibly generous, Brina. It's what Claire would have wanted, I replied softly. But what Jason couldn't see, what was hidden in the legal language that Thomas had crafted so carefully, was a small clause buried on page 7 of the contract. A clause that would transfer ownership of all his assets to me if he defaulted on the loan for any reason. A clause that was designed to be triggered by circumstances I was already putting into motion. Jason signed the papers with hands that shook slightly from relief and gratitude. As he folded the check and put it in his wallet, he looked at me with something approaching genuine emotion. I don't know how to thank you for this. You don't need to thank me. Just promise me you'll be more careful with your finances going forward. And Jason. I reached across the table and patted his hand gently. Maybe we could have dinner sometime. I'd like to hear about how you're doing, what you're planning for the future. I'd like that, he said, and for a moment I almost believed he meant it. After he left, Thomas and I sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. The trap is set, he said finally. Beautifully set. I gathered my purse and coat, feeling a deep satisfaction settle in my chest. How long do you think it will take? Based on what you've told me about the pressures you're still applying? 3 months, maybe 4. He'll use the money to pay down some debts, feel temporarily secure, maybe even relax his spending discipline a bit. But the underlying problems haven't changed. And when he defaults, the contract is ironclad. Everything he owns becomes yours. The house, the rental property, his business assets, even his personal possessions. It's all specified in the collateral clauses he was too desperate to read carefully. I thought about Jason driving home in his BMW, probably calling friends to share the good news about his unexpected salvation, maybe even planning to celebrate with an expensive dinner he could now afford again. He had no idea that the money in his wallet was poisoned, that every dollar came with strings attached that would eventually strangle everything he held dear. He thought his dead wife's mother had forgiven him, had chosen mercy over justice. He was wrong. The check I'd given him wasn't salvation. It was a noose, and I'd handed him the rope to hang himself with. Claire would be proud, Thomas said quietly. Yes, I agreed, thinking of my daughter's final wishes and her prescient understanding of the man she'd married. She would be. As I drove home through the December rain, I allowed myself a moment of pure satisfaction. Jason thought he'd been rescued by an act of maternal kindness. Instead, he'd just signed his own death warrant. The game was entering its final phase, and he still didn't know he was playing. The most elegant traps are the ones your victims build for themselves. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came the final phase of Jason's destruction. The money I'd given him had bought him exactly what I'd intended: false security and a temporary reprieve that made him careless about the dangers still circling his life. For 3 months, Jason had used my loan to pay down his most pressing debts and stabilize his cash flow. His stress levels decreased visibly. He started posting more optimistic updates on social media, rejoined his networking groups, and even began dating again, a local attorney named Rebecca who seemed impressed by his apparent financial recovery. But what Jason didn't understand was that I'd only treated the symptoms of his financial disease, not the underlying condition. The fundamental problems that had made him vulnerable in the first place were still active, still working to destroy him from within. And I was making sure they accelerated. His confidence is growing, Daniel reported during our monthly meeting. He's talking about expanding his business, maybe hiring an associate. He even looked at upgrading his apartment to something more upscale. And his spending? Back to old patterns. The BMW lease renewal, expensive dinners with a new girlfriend, a vacation to Hawaii last month that cost more than most people make in 3 months. Daniel shook his head. He's treating your loan like found money rather than borrowed money. Perfect. What about the businesses we've been targeting? 2 more of his clients have decided to explore other options. That's 60% of his revenue base gone in the past 6 months. He's scrambling to replace them, but the market's competitive and his reputation for reliability has taken some hits. The hits to his reputation weren't accidental. Through carefully placed conversations and strategic networking, I'd made sure that potential clients heard subtle concerns about Jason's recent instability and personal distractions. Nothing actionable, nothing he could confront directly, just enough doubt to make people choose safer alternatives. And the rental property. The new apartment complex you built is stealing his tenants. Both units are vacant now, and he's had to lower the rent twice to try to attract new people. Even at the reduced rate, he's barely covering the mortgage and maintenance costs. I smiled, remembering the cold dismissal in Jason's voice when he told me he couldn't feed an extra mouth. Now he was learning what it felt like when the mouths he was trying to feed were his own hungry debts. Timeline. Based on his current trajectory, he'll start missing payments on something within 6 weeks. The rental property mortgage will probably go first. It's his most vulnerable asset. And that will trigger the default clause in our agreement. Automatically. He pledged all his assets as collateral, including the rental property. Miss one payment on anything, and the entire portfolio transfers to you. The beauty of the contract Thomas had crafted was its comprehensive nature. Jason had been so desperate for the loan that he'd agreed to pledge everything he owned as security, not just for the money I'd given him, but for all his existing debts as well. It was an unusual arrangement, but not illegal, and Jason's attorney had apparently been too focused on the favorable interest rate to examine the collateral requirements carefully. One missed payment anywhere, and I would own his house, his business, his rental property, even his personal possessions. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd inherited from Claire, everything that represented his identity and status would become mine. But I wasn't content to simply wait for financial gravity to take its course. I wanted to ensure that when Jason fell, he fell completely and without possibility of recovery. That's when I implemented the final pressure. Through Pacific Asset Management, one of my shell companies, I purchased the remaining 60% of Jason's debt that I didn't already own. Credit cards, business loans, even the note on his BMW. It took several months and cost me nearly $500,000, but by May I was Jason's primary creditor for virtually everything he owed. And creditors, I'd learned, had considerable power to accelerate payment schedules when they had concerns about a borrower's stability. Mr. Hartwell, the letter began, Pacific Asset Management has reviewed your account status and has concerns about your ability to meet your ongoing obligations. Based on recent changes in your business revenue and debt-to-income ratio, we are exercising our right to demand immediate payment of the outstanding balance. I sent similar letters for all his major debts, each demanding full payment within 30 days or facing immediate collection actions. The total amount, $847,000. Jason's response was exactly what I'd hoped for, panic followed by desperate action. He called Thomas's office within hours of receiving the letters, demanding to speak with me about an emergency situation. He sounded terrified, Thomas told me. Apparently, he owes more money than he realized, and several creditors are demanding immediate payment. How unfortunate for him. He wants to meet with you tomorrow. Says he has a proposition that might help both of you. I'm sure he does. Set it up for Thursday afternoon. And Thomas? Make sure you have all the foreclosure paperwork ready. I suspect we'll need it soon. The meeting took place in Thomas's conference room, the same space where I'd offered Jason what he believed was salvation 4 months earlier. But this time, the roles were clearly defined. He was the supplicant, and I was the one holding all the power. Jason looked terrible. The stress of the past week had aged him visibly, and his usually perfect grooming showed signs of neglect. His hands shook slightly as he spread financial documents across the table, trying to organize numbers that refused to add up to anything but disaster. Brina, thank God you agreed to see me. I'm in serious trouble. I heard. Multiple creditors demanding immediate payment. That must be very stressful. It doesn't make sense. These debts were all on manageable payment schedules, and suddenly everyone wants their money at once. It's like someone coordinated this attack on me. I maintained an expression of maternal concern while internally savoring his choice of words.
Attack.
If only he knew how precisely accurate that was. What do you need from me, Jason? I need more money. A larger loan, maybe $400,000, enough to pay off these creditors and give me breathing room to rebuild my business. $400,000 is a significant amount. What would you offer as collateral? Everything. The house, the rental property, my business assets. I'll sign whatever you need. His voice cracked slightly. I don't have any other options. Jason, you already pledged those assets as collateral for the loan I gave you in December. You can't pledge the same assets twice. Then maybe we could modify that agreement? Increase the amount, extend the terms? I studied him with the same detached interest a scientist might show toward a particularly interesting specimen. Let me ask you something. Have you been keeping up with your payments on the rental property mortgage? His face went pale. There have been some cash flow issues. I'm only 2 weeks behind, and I was planning to catch up as soon as. 2 weeks constitutes a default under the terms of our agreement, Jason. All your assets are now legally mine. The silence in the room was absolute. I watched as understanding dawned in Jason's eyes, followed by disbelief, then growing horror as he began to comprehend the scope of what had just happened. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Thomas, would you show Mr. Hartwell the relevant contract provisions? Thomas slid a copy of the agreement across the table, the default clause highlighted in yellow. Jason read it 3 times, his face growing more ashen with each repetition. This is impossible. You can't take everything because of one missed payment. Actually, I can. You signed a very comprehensive agreement, Jason. You are so grateful for my help that you agreed to terms most people would never accept. But I used your money to pay down my debts. I'm in better shape now than I was before. Are you? Because from where I sit, you're about to lose your house, your business, and everything else you own. That doesn't sound like better shape to me. Jason stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is insane. You're Claire's mother. Family doesn't do this to family. Family? I rose as well, and for the first time since Claire's funeral, I let him see the full force of my anger. You threw me out of my daughter's house on the day of her funeral. You told me you couldn't feed an extra mouth. You treated me like garbage that needed to be disposed of as quickly as possible. I was grieving. You were calculating. You saw opportunity to get rid of an inconvenience, and you took it. Well, Jason, now you're the inconvenience. Claire wouldn't want this. She loved me. Claire also loved me, and she made sure I'd have the resources to protect myself from people who might try to take advantage of her death. I gathered my purse and moved toward the door. The foreclosure proceedings will begin Monday morning. You have until Friday to vacate the house. Wait. Jason's voice cracked with desperation. There has to be something we can work out. Some way to fix this. I paused at the door and looked back at him one final time. You know what, Jason? You're right. There is. Wait. Jason's voice cracked with desperation. There has to be something we can work out. Some way to fix this. I paused at the door and looked back at him one final time. You know what, Jason? You're right. There is something we can work out. Hope flickered in his eyes.
What?
I'll make you the same offer you made me at Claire's grave. You can figure something out. You always do. I left him sitting in that conference room, surrounded by legal documents that transferred his entire life to the woman he'd thrown away like refuse. Through the window, I could see him with his head in his hands, finally understanding that the mercy I'd shown him had been anything but merciful. The trap had been perfect, baited with his own greed, sprung by his own carelessness, and made inescapable by legal documents he'd signed in his desperate gratitude. Jason Hartwell had destroyed himself with my money, and now he was going to learn what it felt like to have nowhere to turn and no one to help him. The wheel had come full circle, and I was the one in control now. The most satisfying justice is watching someone reap exactly what they've sown. The foreclosure proceedings moved with the cold efficiency of well-oiled legal machinery. Within 2 weeks of our confrontation in Thomas's office, Jason received official notice that all his properties would be seized to satisfy his defaulted obligations. The house where he'd lived with Claire, the rental duplex that was supposed to secure his future, even his office space, all of it was being transferred to me through the shell companies that had purchased his debts. I drove by the house on a Tuesday morning in late May, curious to see how Jason was handling his new reality. The BMW was gone, repossessed 3 days earlier when he'd missed his lease payment. The lawn needed mowing, and I could see boxes stacked behind the living room windows where he was presumably packing what remained of his life. Claire's house. The place where I'd lived for 6 months, caring for my dying daughter while Jason went to work and pretended everything was normal. The place where I'd cooked meals and cleaned and tried to maintain some semblance of family life, even as cancer ate away at the center of our world. The place where Jason had told me to pack my bags because he couldn't feed an extra mouth. Now he was the one packing bags, and he had no idea where he was going to go. My phone rang as I sat in my car, watching the house that was now legally mine. Brina? It's Daniel. I thought you'd want to know. Jason's moving out today. Looks like he's putting everything he can't take with him into storage. What about his business? Officially closed as of yesterday. His remaining clients have been transferred to competitors, and he's sold what equipment he could to cover immediate expenses. Daniel paused. He's also been asking around about job opportunities. Apparently, he's willing to take pretty much anything at this point. Any luck? Not much. Word's gotten around about his financial troubles, and in his industry, that kind of reputation problem is hard to overcome. Most firms won't touch someone who's been through bankruptcy proceedings. I felt a deep satisfaction settle in my chest. Jason was learning what I'd learned in that Walmart parking lot. What it felt like to have your world collapse around you while everyone you'd counted on disappeared. Where is he living? Extended stay motel out by the airport. Cheapest place he could find that takes weekly payments. Apparently he's been trying to reach you through Thomas's office, but your lawyer's been screening the calls. What does he want? To negotiate, probably.
Or beg.
Hard to tell the difference at this point. That afternoon, Thomas called to confirm Daniel's report. Jason's been calling multiple times daily, he told me. Very persistent. He claims he has new information that might change your mind about the foreclosure. What kind of information?
He won't say.
Just keeps insisting that he needs to speak with you personally, that there's something important you need to know. I considered this. Jason was desperate enough to try anything, and desperate people sometimes became dangerous. But I was also curious about what card he thought he still had to play. Set up a meeting. Tomorrow afternoon. But make it somewhere public, that cafe on 5th Street. And Thomas? I want you there as a witness. Are you sure that's wise? Jason's broke, homeless, and his reputation is destroyed. He's not dangerous anymore, he's just pathetic. But I want to hear what he thinks is going to save him. The next day, I arrived at the cafe 10 minutes early and chose a table near the window where I could watch Jason approach. When he appeared, walking slowly down the sidewalk, I was shocked by how much he deteriorated in just 2 weeks. His usually perfect appearance had crumbled along with his finances. His clothes were wrinkled and showed signs of repeated wear, his hair was unkempt, and he'd lost more weight. But it was his eyes that showed the real damage. Hollow, desperate, the eyes of a man who'd run out of options and was grasping at increasingly unlikely possibilities. He sat down across from me with the careful movements of someone whose confidence had been completely shattered. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said, his voice hoarse. "Thomas said you had something important to discuss."
Ida.
Jason reached into a battered briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. "I've been going through Claire's things, trying to understand how everything went so wrong so fast. And I found something." He slid a document across the table. It was a bank statement from an account I'd never seen before, dated 6 months before Claire's death. She had money, Brina. A lot of money. Money she never told me about. I glanced at the statement, maintaining my expression of mild curiosity. "I don't understand what this has to do with anything." "Don't you see? If Claire had this money, then maybe there are other accounts, other assets, things that should have been part of her estate, but weren't disclosed." His voice grew more animated as he spoke, as if he'd convinced himself this fantasy might actually save him. "If we can find those assets, we could split them. You could have half, and I could use my half to pay off the debts and get my life back." I studied Jason's face, seeing the desperate hope there, the willingness to believe in any possibility that might rescue him from the consequences of his own actions. "Jason," I said gently, "even if such accounts existed, they would belong to Claire's estate, which means they would belong to her legal heir, which was me. I was her husband. Were you. I smiled slightly. Because according to this bank statement, this account was opened after your marriage, but before Claire's name legally changed. This account belongs to Claire Asher, not Claire Hartwell. Jason's face went white as he realized the implication. Which means, I continued, that any assets in this account would belong to Claire's blood relatives, not her spouse. They would belong to her mother. But you can't have known about this account. You said you didn't know Claire had any other money. I said I didn't understand what this had to do with anything. I never said I didn't know about the account. The truth hit him like a physical blow. I could see the moment when Jason finally understood that his ex-mother-in-law wasn't just lucky or well-connected. She was wealthy. Wealthy enough to orchestrate his destruction, wealthy enough to buy his debts and manipulate his circumstances, wealthy enough to crush him without breaking a financial sweat. You did this, he whispered. All of it. The lost clients, the creditors calling in loans, the financial pressure. It was you. Yes. But why? I know I hurt you, but this is destroying my entire life. I leaned forward slightly, making sure he could see the cold satisfaction in my eyes. Do you remember what you said to me at Claire's grave, Jason? When I asked where I was supposed to go. He was quiet, but I could see the memory playing behind his eyes. You said I'd figure something out. That I always do. I gathered my purse and stood up. Well, I figured something out. I figured out how to take everything you cared about and leave you with nothing, just like you did to me. Claire wouldn't want this. Claire wanted her mother protected. She left me the resources to protect myself from people like you. I paused at his chair. She also left me detailed instructions about what to do if her husband turned out to be the kind of man who would throw away his wife's mother on the day of her funeral. Instructions? Claire knew you better than you knew yourself, Jason. She saw your true nature, your capacity for cruelty, when it served your interests. And she made sure I'd have everything I needed to respond appropriately. I walked away from the table, leaving Jason sitting alone with the wreckage of his delusions. Through the cafe window, I could see him staring at the bank statement, finally understanding that he'd been playing a game where his opponent had held all the cards from the very beginning. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood on my apartment balcony, looking out over the city lights. Somewhere out there, Jason was in his motel room, probably staring at the ceiling and wondering how his life had collapsed so completely. He still didn't know the worst part. He still didn't know that the game wasn't over yet. The cruelest gift is hope offered to someone who doesn't deserve it. Summer settled over Portland like a warm blanket, and with it came a sense of completion I hadn't felt since Claire's diagnosis. Jason's world had crumbled exactly as I'd planned, leaving him financially ruined, professionally destroyed, and socially isolated. The man who'd thrown me out of my daughter's house was now living in a weekly rate motel, working part-time at a call center, and driving a 15-year-old Honda he'd bought with his last credit card. But as satisfying as his destruction had been to orchestrate, I found myself wanting something more. Something final. A conclusion that would close this chapter of my life permanently and allow me to move forward without the constant low-level hum of unfinished business. I'd been thinking about Claire's scarf, the soft blue cashmere that still carried the faint scent of her perfume. It lived in my dresser drawer now, wrapped in tissue paper like a sacred relic. Sometimes I would take it out and hold it while I planned Jason's next humiliation, remembering how she'd worn it during those final months when everything else felt harsh against her fragile skin. Claire had been so young, so full of plans and dreams that the cancer had stolen. She'd wanted to travel to Ireland, to write the novel she'd been thinking about for years, to maybe have children if her health improved. Instead, she'd spent her last months fighting a losing battle while her husband counted the days until he could reclaim his freedom. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Jason's financial ruin wasn't enough. Money could be replaced, credit could be rebuilt, reputations could be rehabilitated. What I wanted was something more permanent, something that would ensure Jason Hartwell could never again hurt anyone the way he'd hurt me. That's when I decided to buy the lake house. It was a beautiful property in the Cascade Mountains, about 2 hours from Portland, situated on a private lake surrounded by dense forest. The house itself was modest but elegant: 2 bedrooms, a stone fireplace, a wraparound porch that overlooked the water. But what made it perfect for my purposes was its isolation and the dangerous curve in the mountain road that led to it. The previous owner had warned me about that curve during the sale negotiations. "Lost 3 cars over the edge in the past decade," he'd said. "Road gets slippery when it rains, and there's not much guardrail to speak of. You'll want to drive real careful up there." I bought the property in cash and spent the month of July having it prepared for what I had in mind. New furniture, a well-stocked kitchen, and most importantly, some subtle modifications to the driveway and approach road that would make certain outcomes more likely when the weather conditions were right. In August, I called Jason. He answered on the first ring, his voice carrying the desperate hope of someone who'd been waiting for any lifeline, no matter how unlikely. "Verena?" "Hello, Jason. How are you managing?"
I'm surviving.
"Look, if this is about the money I owe you, I'm working on a payment plan. It's going to take time, but I can. Actually, I called about something else entirely. I have a business proposition that might interest you." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "What kind of proposition?" he asked finally. "I've been thinking about Claire lately, about how much she loved you, and how she'd want me to take care of the people she cared about. I know things have been difficult for you, and I feel partially responsible for that." "Partially responsible?" "I could have been more understanding about your financial situation, more flexible with the loan terms. Instead, I let my hurt feelings about the funeral influence my business decisions." I paused, letting maternal warmth creep into my voice. "I think I owe you a chance to start over." "I don't understand." "I've purchased a property development opportunity in the mountains. Nothing huge, but there's potential for significant returns if it's handled properly. I need someone with your marketing expertise to help me evaluate the opportunity and develop a business plan." "You want to hire me?" "I want to partner with you. If the numbers work out the way I think they will, we could both profit substantially. Enough for you to pay off your debts and rebuild your life properly this time." Another long silence. "Why would you do this? After everything that's happened?" "Because Claire loved you, Jason. And because I'm tired of carrying anger around like a stone in my chest. Life's too short to hold grudges forever." The lie came easily because it contained just enough truth to be believable. I was tired of carrying anger, but not in the way Jason would understand. "When would you want to meet?" "This weekend, if possible. I could drive up to the property Saturday afternoon, and we could discuss the details over dinner. Nothing formal, just a chance to talk through the possibilities." "Where is this property?" "About 2 hours east of the city, up in the mountains. Beautiful area, very private, very peaceful. I think you'd like it. I don't have reliable transportation right now. I could pick you up. Or, if you prefer, I could arrange for a rental car." "Whatever makes you more comfortable." Jason was quiet for so long I began to wonder if he'd hung up. "Jason? Are you still there?" "Yeah, I'm here. This is unexpected." "Good things often are." I softened my voice even further. "Look, I know you don't have any reason to trust me after what happened with the loan. But this isn't charity, and it's not forgiveness. It's business. If you're not interested, I can find someone else."
No.
"No, I'm interested. Very interested. It's just..." "Just what?" "It feels too good to be true." I smiled, thinking about the mountain road and the careful modifications I'd made to ensure that certain outcomes were more likely than others. Sometimes good things happen to people who've been through hard times, Jason. Sometimes the universe decides to balance the scales. "Okay,
Yes.
I'd like to hear more about this opportunity. Wonderful. I'll pick you up Saturday at noon. We can drive up together, look at the property, discuss the business plan over dinner. I'll have you back in the city by Sunday afternoon. Brina, thank you for giving me this chance. I know I don't deserve it. Everyone deserves a second chance, Jason. Claire taught me that. After I hung up, I walked to my dresser and took out Claire's scarf, holding it against my cheek and breathing in the fading scent of her perfume. Soon, sweetheart, I whispered. Soon your mother will have finished taking care of everything. The weather forecast for Saturday called for rain.
Perfect.
Justice delayed is not justice denied. Sometimes it's justice perfected. Saturday morning dawned gray and promising, with the kind of heavy clouds that meant serious rain by afternoon. I dressed carefully for the day ahead, comfortable driving clothes, practical shoes, and a lightweight jacket that wouldn't restrict my movement. Most importantly, I wore Claire's scarf around my neck, the soft blue cashmere a constant reminder of why this day was necessary. I picked up Jason at his motel precisely at noon. He was waiting outside, looking better than he had in months. He'd gotten a haircut, pressed his clothes, and made an obvious effort to project confidence and professionalism. The desperate hope in his eyes was almost pitiful as he climbed into my car. Thank you again for this opportunity, he said as we drove through the city toward the mountain highway. I've been thinking about marketing strategies all week. I have some ideas that might really maximize the property's potential. I'm sure you do. You always were good at seeing possibilities others missed. We made small talk as Portland gave way to smaller towns, then to forested hills that grew steeper and more remote with each mile. Jason seemed to relax as we drove, his natural charm reasserting itself as he began to believe that his luck might finally be changing. This is beautiful country, he observed as we climbed into the Cascades. Very private. Perfect for an exclusive development. That's exactly what I was thinking. The kind of place where wealthy people pay premium prices for privacy and natural beauty. By the time we reached the turnoff to the lake, it had started to rain, light drops that speckled the windshield and made the narrow mountain road gleam like black glass. The final 3 miles to the house wound through dense forest, with steep drops on one side and rocky walls on the other. This road makes me nervous, Jason admitted as I navigated a particularly sharp curve. Hope you have good insurance. The best money can buy. The house appeared through the trees like something from a fairy tale, warm lights glowing in the windows, smoke rising from the chimney, the lake stretching beyond it like a mirror reflecting the gray sky. I'd spent considerable money, making it look perfect for this moment, a place where dreams might come true and new partnerships might be born. Wow, Jason breathed as we pulled into the circular driveway. This is incredible. Wait until you see the inside. I'd furnished the house with a kind of understated luxury that suggested both wealth and taste. Jason walked through the rooms with obvious appreciation, already mentally calculating property values and development possibilities. The bones are perfect, he said, running his hand along the stone mantelpiece. And this location... God, Brina, this could be worth millions if it's developed properly. That's why I need your expertise. I understand the financial aspects, but marketing and positioning aren't my strengths. We spent the afternoon walking the property, discussing potential uses and development strategies. Jason grew more animated with each conversation, his professional excitement genuine as he outlined his vision for transforming the area into an exclusive resort community. As evening approached, I prepared dinner while Jason sat by the fire, sketching preliminary plans on a legal pad I'd provided. The rain had intensified, drumming against the windows and turning the world outside into a blur of water and darkness. This feels good, he said as we sat down to eat. Like I'm finally doing something worthwhile again instead of just surviving day to day. Everyone needs purpose, Jason. Work that matters. Goals worth pursuing. I can't tell you how much this means to me. After everything that happened, I thought my career was over. I thought I'd never have another chance to prove myself. I watched him eat with genuine appetite, probably the best meal he'd had in months. Jason, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you ever think about that day at the cemetery? About what you said to me after Claire's funeral? His fork paused halfway to his mouth. Sometimes. What do you think about? He set down his fork and looked uncomfortable. I think about how grief makes us do stupid things. How fear and pain can make us cruel to people who don't deserve it. Do you regret it?
Yes. God, yes.
I was terrified of being alone, of having to figure out my life without Claire. And you reminded me of her, of everything I'd lost. I couldn't handle that. He looked directly at me. I know saying I'm sorry doesn't fix anything, but I am sorry. Deeply, truly sorry. I nodded slowly, as if processing his words.
Thank you for saying that.
It helps more than you know. I should have been better. Claire deserved better from me, and so did you. Claire loved you very much, Jason. Even at the end, even when she was in so much pain, she worried about how you'd cope without her. She was too good for me. Yes, I agreed quietly. She was. We finished dinner in contemplative silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the rain against the windows. As I cleared the dishes, Jason returned to his sketching, occasionally looking up to ask questions about my vision for the property. By 9 o'clock, the storm had intensified into something more serious. Wind howled through the trees, and rain hammered the roof with increasing violence. Maybe I should stay overnight, Jason suggested, glancing toward the windows. This doesn't look like safe driving weather. Unfortunately, there's only one bedroom. I could take the couch. No, absolutely not. I'll take the couch. It's your house. Actually, Jason, I think you should go back tonight. He looked surprised. In this weather? Brina, that mountain road is dangerous enough in good conditions. I know, but I have an early morning appointment tomorrow that I can't miss. If you stay overnight, I'd have to drive you back very early, and that would be inconvenient for both of us. I could call for a ride or rent a car.
Nonsense.
I'll drive you back. We can continue our discussion during the trip. Jason looked uncertainly at the storm raging outside. Are you sure it's safe? I've driven that road dozens of times. I know every curve. I smiled reassuringly. Besides, we're both adults. A little rain won't hurt us. If you're sure. I'm sure. But we should leave soon, before it gets any worse. I went to the bedroom to get my jacket, and while I was there, I opened the small black bag I'd brought with me. Inside were several items I'd hoped I wouldn't need, but had prepared just in case. A small knife, zip ties, and a bottle of pills that would ensure cooperation if Jason became difficult. But looking at him now, relaxed and grateful and completely trusting, I realized that more direct methods wouldn't be necessary. Jason would cooperate because he wanted to, because he believed in the future I'd shown him, because he thought his luck had finally changed. He had no idea that his luck was about to run out permanently. Ready, I called, putting on Claire's scarf and adjusting it carefully around my neck. Ready as I'll ever be. We ran through the rain to my car, Jason holding his jacket over his head while I unlocked the doors. The interior was immediately filled with the sound of water drumming on the roof and the smell of wet forest. Jesus, this is really coming down, Jason said as I started the engine. Maybe we really should wait until morning. We'll be fine. Trust me. I drove slowly down the winding driveway, the headlights cutting through sheets of rain that made everything beyond 20 feet invisible. The access road was worse, with water running across the pavement and loose gravel making the surface treacherous. Careful on the curves, Jason warned as we approached the first sharp turn. I can barely see the edge of the road. I know this road by heart, I assured him, though I slowed even further as we navigated the serpentine path down the mountainside. We drove in tense silence for several minutes, both of us focused on the dangerous conditions. Jason gripped the door handle with white knuckles, clearly regretting his decision to leave the safety of the house. "There," he said with relief as we rounded a particularly sharp curve. "I think that's the worst of it behind us." But it wasn't. The worst was still ahead. A sweeping left turn that dropped away into a deep ravine, protected only by a guardrail that had been damaged years ago and never properly repaired. I knew that curve intimately. I'd driven it dozens of times while preparing for this night, studying the exact point where the guardrail was weakest, calculating angles and speeds and impact points with the precision of an engineer. "Almost there," I said softly, my hands steady on the steering wheel despite the rain and wind. "Thank God. I'll be happy to get back to civilization." As we approached the final curve, I reached up and touched Claire's scarf, feeling the soft cashmere beneath my fingers. "Jason," I said, my voice barely audible over the storm. "Yeah. Do you remember what you told me that day at the cemetery? When I asked where I was supposed to go?" He turned to look at me, confusion in his eyes. "What do you mean?" "You said I'd figure something out. That I always do." "Brina, why are you bringing this up now?" I pressed down on the accelerator as we entered the curve, feeling the car respond immediately to the increased speed. "Because I figured something out, Jason. I figured out exactly what you deserve." The moment of understanding hit him, just as we reached the apex of the turn. His eyes widened in horror as he realized that we were going too fast, that the guardrail was approaching at the wrong angle, that the woman driving had no intention of trying to stay on the road. "Brina, no. You're going to kill us both." I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, sending the car straight toward the damaged section of guardrail. But at the last second, I did something Jason couldn't have anticipated. I released my seatbelt and threw myself toward the driver's side door, trusting in the modifications I'd made to the car's safety systems. "No, Jason," I said, my voice calm despite the chaos erupting around us. "Just you." The car hit the guardrail at exactly the right angle and speed to punch through the rotted posts. Jason's side of the vehicle went over the edge first, the passenger compartment crumpling as it struck the rocky slope below. I rolled clear of the wreckage, my body trained by months of preparation to absorb the impact and minimize injury. Pain shot through my shoulder and ribs, but nothing felt broken, nothing that wouldn't heal. From the ravine below came the sound of metal grinding against stone, followed by an ominous silence. I lay still for several minutes, listening to the rain and letting my body recover from the shock. Then I carefully made my way to the edge of the drop-off and looked down. The car had rolled twice before coming to rest against a cluster of pine trees. The passenger side was completely crushed, and there was no movement from inside. Jason Hartwell would never hurt another grieving mother. He would never throw away another person who loved him. He would never again mistake kindness for weakness or mercy for cowardice. I walked slowly through the rain back toward the lake house, my steps steady despite the pain in my shoulder. In the morning, I would call 911 and report that my car had skidded off the road during the storm. I would tell them about my business partner who'd been with me, how I'd tried to save him but couldn't reach him in time. The investigation would show exactly what I wanted it to show: a tragic accident on a dangerous road during severe weather conditions. The kind of thing that happened all too often in the mountains, the kind of senseless loss that reminded everyone how fragile life could be. But I would know the truth. And somewhere in whatever came after this life, Claire would know it too. Justice had been served. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet efficiency of natural consequences finally catching up to someone who'd forgotten that actions have prices. I reached up and touched Claire's scarf, still damp from the rain but intact, just like the love that had motivated everything I'd done. "It's finished, sweetheart," I whispered into the storm. "You can rest now." The rain continued to fall, washing away tire tracks and footprints and any evidence that this night had been anything other than a terrible accident. By morning, I would be the sole survivor of a tragedy. By afternoon, I would own everything Jason had ever claimed to love. And for the rest of my life, I would remember the look in his eyes when he finally understood that some people shouldn't be underestimated, no matter how powerless they appear. The perfect ending is the one that never needs to be explained. I walked through the rain for 47 minutes before I reached the lake house, each step deliberate and measured despite the pain radiating from my shoulder and the cuts on my hands from the broken glass. The storm was beginning to weaken, the violent winds settling into steady rain that would continue through the night and wash away whatever evidence remained of what had really happened on that mountain curve. Inside the house, I methodically cleaned my wounds and changed into dry clothes. In the bathroom mirror, I looked like exactly what I was supposed to be, a woman who'd survived a terrible accident, shaken and injured but alive through sheer luck and the grace of God. I set my phone alarm for 6 a.m., then sat by the dying fire with a cup of tea and Claire's scarf wrapped around my shoulders. Outside, the rain continued its work of erasure, and somewhere in the ravine below, Jason Hartwell was learning the final lesson about what happened when you discarded people who loved you. When morning came, I called 911 with exactly the right amount of shock and grief in my voice. "There's been an accident," I told the dispatcher, letting my words shake as if I were barely holding myself together. "My car went off the road in the storm last night. My friend was with me. I think he's dead." The response was swift and professional. Emergency vehicles arrived within 20 minutes, followed by state police investigators who treated me with the gentle courtesy reserved for traumatized survivors. They wrapped me in blankets, checked my injuries, and asked careful questions about what I remembered from the crash. The road was so slippery, I told them, tears streaming down my face. I was driving slowly, being so careful, but we hit that curve and the car just went sideways. I tried to steer out of it, but there was nothing I could do. "These mountain roads are dangerous in weather like this," Officer Martinez said sympathetically. "You're lucky to be alive, ma'am." I keep thinking I should have done something different. Should have stayed at the house overnight instead of trying to drive back in the storm. I dabbed at my eyes with a tissue. Jason wanted to wait until morning, but I insisted we leave. "This is all my fault." "Ma'am, you can't blame yourself for an accident. These things happen, especially on roads like this one." The recovery of Jason's body took most of the day. The car had to be winched up from the ravine using specialized equipment, and the coroner's examination was conducted with a thoroughness that all suspicious deaths required, even those that appeared to be straightforward accidents. But there was nothing suspicious to find. Jason had died from massive trauma consistent with being thrown around inside a vehicle that had rolled down a steep slope. My injuries were consistent with being in the same accident, but on the protected side of the car. The skid marks on the road showed exactly what I'd told them. A vehicle that had lost traction in the rain and gone out of control. Preliminary findings suggest Mr. Hartwell died instantly, the coroner told me that evening. He wouldn't have suffered. That's some comfort, I suppose. I pressed Claire's scarf to my eyes. He was such a good man. He didn't deserve this. The investigation continued for 3 days, but it was perfunctory. Mountain road accident during severe weather, 1 fatality, 1 survivor. It was the kind of tragedy that happens several times a year in Oregon. The only unusual aspect was that the survivor had walked away from a crash that had killed her passenger, but the evidence clearly showed that luck and seating position had made the difference. On Thursday, they released Jason's body to the funeral home he'd specified in his emergency contacts. There wasn't much left to release. No family, no close friends, no one who cared enough to arrange more than the most basic services. I attended his funeral. It was held at the same chapel where we'd said goodbye to Claire 6 months earlier, but this time the pews were nearly empty. A handful of former colleagues, a few neighbors from his old life, and me, the woman who'd supposedly been his business partner and was now his chief mourner. I wore black, of course, and Claire's scarf, and I cried genuine tears as they lowered Jason's casket into the ground. Not tears of grief, tears of completion, of justice finally served, of a promise kept to my daughter's memory. After the service, I drove to Claire's grave and placed fresh flowers on her headstone. "It's done, sweetheart," I whispered, kneeling beside the marble marker. "He'll never hurt anyone else the way he hurt us." The weeks that followed brought the final pieces of my victory into place. As Jason's creditor and the beneficiary of his life insurance policy, a small policy he'd forgotten to change after Claire's death, I inherited what remained of his assets. The house he'd shared with my daughter, the rental property he'd tried to use as his foundation for the future, even his personal possessions that had been stored when he lost everything. I sold it all. The house brought $700,000 from a young couple who loved its character and location. The rental property went to an investor for $300,000. Jason's belongings, furniture, electronics, even his clothes, I donated to charity, keeping only one item, a photograph of him with Claire from their wedding day. But I didn't keep it as a memento. I kept it as evidence of what I'd accomplished. In the photo, Jason looked confident and happy, his arm around my beautiful daughter as they posed for their future together. He had no idea that the woman standing behind the camera, the mother-in-law he would later discard like trash, would someday orchestrate his complete destruction. I framed the photo and placed it on my mantelpiece, not as a memorial, but as a reminder of what happened to people who mistook my love for weakness. 3 months after Jason's death, I received a call from Thomas Eddings. "Brina, I wanted you to know that the estate settlement is complete. All of Jason's remaining debts have been satisfied, and the surplus funds have been transferred to your account." "How much?" "After all expenses, approximately $1.2 million. I smiled, thinking about the man who told me he couldn't feed an extra mouth. In the end, Jason had fed me quite well. "There's something else," Thomas continued. "I received a call from a journalist who's writing a story about mountain road safety. Apparently, Jason's accident was the 3rd fatality on that particular curve in the past 5 years. They're pushing for better guardrails and warning signs." "That's good. Maybe it will prevent other tragedies." "The journalist wanted to interview you about the accident, about what you remember. I told them you preferred not to relive the trauma, but they were quite persistent. I don't have anything to add to what I already told the police." That's what I told them. "But Brina, if anyone ever asks if there are ever any questions about that night?" "Yes, you saved yourself when you could have died with him. Claire would be proud that you survived." After I hung up, I walked to my apartment window and looked out over the city where I'd rebuilt my life. Somewhere out there was the motel where Jason had spent his final months, the call center where he'd worked his last job, the streets where he'd driven his broken-down Honda and dreamed of better days that would never come. I felt no guilt about his death, no regret about the choices I'd made. Jason had sealed his fate the moment he decided to throw away the woman who'd loved his wife more than life itself. Everything that followed had been natural consequence, justice delayed, but not denied. 6 months later, I bought a different lake house in a different state, this one with safer roads and better guardrails. I furnished it with beautiful things and filled it with books, and sometimes in the evenings I would sit by the fire with Claire's scarf around my shoulders and remember the daughter who'd been taken from me too soon. But I never thought about Jason. He'd served his purpose in my story, and that story was finished. I was 60 years old, wealthy, healthy, and completely free to live whatever life I chose. I had no debts, no obligations, no one depending on me, and no one I needed to please or placate or fear. Jason had tried to discard me, but instead he'd liberated me. Some revenge is loud and dramatic, full of sound and fury that signifies everything. Mine had been quiet, patient, and thorough. And quiet, I'd learned, was the kind that lasted forever. The most beautiful endings are the ones that feel like beginnings. 5 years after Jason Hartwell's death, I stood in the garden of my new home in Sedona, watching the sunset paint the red rocks in shades of gold and crimson. At 63, I discovered that revenge, properly executed, didn't consume you, it freed you. The house was everything I dreamed of during those dark months after Claire's death, a sprawling adobe structure built around courtyards and fountains, filled with art and music and the kind of beauty that feeds the soul. I designed every room myself, chosen every piece of furniture, planted every flower in the garden that surrounded me now. It was a home built on justice, paid for with the proceeds of Jason's destruction, and I never felt more at peace. My phone rang as I watched a hawk circle overhead. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer. Ms. Asher? This is Jennifer Walsh from the Portland Tribune. I'm calling about a story I'm working on regarding the Jason Hartwell accident from 5 years ago. I felt a slight chill despite the Arizona heat. I'm not sure what you mean. I'm investigating a pattern of suspicious deaths in Oregon involving people who died shortly after receiving large financial settlements or inheritances. Mr. Hartwell's case caught my attention because of the unusual circumstances surrounding his death. What unusual circumstances? It was a car accident on a dangerous road during a storm. That's true. But it's also true that Mr. Hartwell had recently entered into a business partnership with you that would have restored his finances, and that you were the primary beneficiary of his death. Some people might find that convenient. I walked inside my house, closing the door behind me and checking the locks out of habit. Ms. Walsh, I was in that accident. I was injured. I nearly died myself. Yes, and that's what makes this so interesting. You survived a crash that killed your passenger, and as a result, you inherited everything he owned. Some might call that lucky. Some might call it tragic. I lost a dear friend that night. A dear friend who had thrown you out of his house after your daughter's funeral? A dear friend who had publicly humiliated you and left you homeless? My blood ran cold. This woman had done more research than I'd expected. I don't know what you're implying, Ms. Walsh, but I find this conversation both inappropriate and hurtful. If you're suggesting that I somehow caused that accident, I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just asking questions. For instance, did you know that the guardrail on that curve had been weakened several months before the accident? Someone had cut partway through the support posts, making them more likely to fail under impact. I sat down heavily in my favorite chair, the one that faced the windows overlooking my garden. I wouldn't know anything about that. Of course not. Just like you wouldn't know that several of Jason's major clients received anonymous calls suggesting they might want to consider other vendors. Just like you would know that most of his debt was purchased by shell companies that traced back to offshore accounts. Ms. Walsh, I think this conversation is over. One more question, if you don't mind. The lake house where you were staying that night, records show you purchased it just 3 months before the accident and sold it less than a week afterward. Don't you think that's an interesting coincidence? I hung up the phone and sat in my chair for a long time, watching the shadows lengthen across my garden. So someone had finally connected the dots, had seen the pattern that I'd worked so hard to obscure. The question was what they intended to do with that information. My phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed Thomas Edding's number. Brina, I just received a very interesting call from a journalist in Portland. I think we need to talk. An hour later, Thomas called back. I've been in touch with some contacts in law enforcement. The journalist has been shopping the story around for months, but she doesn't have enough evidence to support her theories. Everything she has is circumstantial, but damaging. Potentially. If the story runs, it will raise questions. There might be pressure to reopen the investigation. And if they do, they'll find exactly what they found 5 years ago. Evidence of a tragic accident on a dangerous road. The physical evidence supports your account completely. The only thing that's changed is someone's interpretation of the financial circumstances. I walked to my mantelpiece and looked at the framed photograph of Jason and Claire on their wedding day. In 5 years, it had never occurred to me to feel guilty about what I'd done. Jason had earned his fate through his own cruelty, and I'd simply been the instrument of natural justice. Thomas, if this story is published, if there's an investigation, what's the worst-case scenario? Honestly, public speculation, media attention, some uncomfortable questions. But without physical evidence of tampering with the car or the road, without witnesses to any kind of planning, without any direct evidence of intent, there's nothing to charge you with. And the best-case scenario? The story gets buried because it's all speculation and innuendo. Or it runs but nobody cares because Jason Hartwell wasn't important enough to generate sustained interest. After Thomas hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and walked out to my garden. The stars were beginning to appear in the desert sky, brilliant and unashamed in the clear air. Let the journalist publish her story. Let the police reopen their investigation. Let the world examine every detail of Jason Hartwell's death and my role in it. They would find a woman who'd survived a terrible accident that had claimed the life of someone she'd tried to help. They would find financial records showing legitimate business dealings and legal inheritance procedures. They would find physical evidence consistent with a tragic but commonplace mountain road accident. What they wouldn't find, what no one would ever find, was proof of what had really happened that night. Because I'd planned too carefully, executed too precisely, and covered my tracks too thoroughly. I was Brina Asher, a woman who'd lost her daughter to cancer and her son-in-law to a car accident. I was a grieving mother who'd tried to help the man her daughter had loved, only to lose him to cruel fate and dangerous roads. I was not a woman who'd systematically destroyed someone's life and then killed them in a carefully orchestrated accident. No matter what anyone suspected, no matter what patterns they thought they saw, that second woman existed only in the shadows between facts and theories. And shadows, as I'd learned over 5 years of perfect freedom, were very difficult places to build a case. I raised my wine glass to the stars and smiled. Some stories end with justice. Some stories end with revenge. Some stories end with peace. Mine had ended with all three, and I was finally ready to begin the next chapter, whatever it might bring. Thank you for joining me on this journey of justice, transformation, and ultimate triumph. If this story reminded you that strength comes in many forms, that intelligence and patience can overcome any betrayal, that sometimes the quiet ones are the most dangerous, then you understand why these stories matter. Hit that subscribe button, ring that notification bell, and remember, never underestimate someone you've wronged, because they might be far more resourceful than you ever imagined. Until next time, this is Her True Stories, reminding you that every ending is really just a new beginning in disguise.